over to Joyce.
Great, thank you so much. It's so nice to be here today, and I'm excited to share this exhibition with you. I just want to begin by saying, because today we're talking about an exhibition called An American Place, I do want to acknowledge those stewards of the land who came before us. Particularly, we will be talking about New World versus Old World, and in the context of art in the United States, we think about the Old World as being Europe, and I just want to acknowledge that the Old World, there are inhabitants who consider this land the Old World as well. So I just want to begin with that acknowledgement. And also want to begin with an acknowledgement that we are celebrating our 50th anniversary. If you haven't heard, I'm sure you have heard, all of this year, all of our exhibitions, many of our programs are going to be centered around celebrating that milestone. And you'll see a few images here from times past. I just adore those cavorting brownies from the late 1970s. That seemed like a very fun gala image there as well. You can see a photo of a very sporty looking Barbara Palmer. I think she was newly elected to the Friends Board in 1982, I think that is. And the middle 1976 installation shot from a major exhibition that year. So it's been very fun to go into our archives and to bring up some of these images. If you are not a member of the museum and you would like to become a member, you would be receiving bi-weekly newsletters from us, e-blasts, and we are going to be highlighting every 2 weeks. We're going to be talking about what we're calling vintage Palmer. So there's a lot of material to celebrate, and please be on the lookout for those e-blasts. And also, I will just make one little pitch. We are going to be working on a series we're calling Palmer Stories. We would love to hear from you. If you remember any of those pictures that you see there, or you were here when the building was built, or you have a favorite staff member or a favorite exhibition that you love, we would love to hear from you. So please be in touch with us. You can easily find our emails at Penn State, but I'm jhr11@psu.edu. So if you are interested in sharing your stories with us, please do reach out. Another commercial, just to let you know, there are other talks coming up around this exhibition. My colleague Adam Thomas will be taking a very deep dive, looking at one pretty amazing painting from the Palmer bequest, namely our Winslow Homer. That is coming up on March 2nd. Oops, oh no. So hopefully I'm not getting on an auto time here. And also March 30th, Erin Coe and I will be sharing the webinar, and we will be offering a little bit of a different take on An American Place. We will be looking at the legacy of this bequest, the formation of the American art collection at the Palmer, and how this bequest fits into that. So I hope that you will join us for that as well. All right, so let's begin. I want to start a little bit by talking about the role of the Palmers. Their impact easily can be felt throughout the collection, throughout the building. You may know they were graduates of Iowa State, but yet we welcomed them anyway to State College when they came in 1955. Of course, they became big supporters of Penn State and of the Palmer. Jim was president and CEO of Secor Electronics, one of the pioneering cable equipment companies in this area, and Secor became the first corporate member of the Friends of the Palmer Museum of Art. I guess it was just the Friends of the Museum of Art at that time, and that was in 1983. And in 1986, the Palmers made the lead gift that would ultimately lead to the renaming of the museum. It's the Palmer Museum of Art in 1988, and the opening of the Charles Moore expansion in 1993. We lost Jim in 2001. And of course, we were able to acquire this gorgeous Jules Olitsky that you see there on the lower right. But also, folks may not know that the Palmers, in addition to the works that they collected and gifted, they have also were wonderful patrons and would often help us acquire works like the Beverly Pepper that you see there in the upper right-hand corner. And I'll also point out too that in 2013, we did a major publication of the Palmer collection in celebration of the promised gift of that collection to the Palmer Museum of Art. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this publication, you can find it at our museum store. And I want to acknowledge the many scholars out there, scholars of American art, who contributed to that catalog, because the label text for this exhibition, and in fact, some of the text for this talk today, is really drawn from that great work. This is not the first time that we have showcased works from this collection. In 2005, we did an exhibition called An Intimate Eye. And I'm kind of marveling at the number of works. I of course, was here then, and I had to check, though, it was 115 works that we managed to show in that exhibition. I think that's because we showed a lot of the ceramics from the Palmer's collection. We also showed more contemporary art than it is in this current exhibition. Their beautiful Dale Ciaffulli, for instance, was on view in that exhibition as well. This exhibition, the focus is a little bit different. The focus is really on the story of American art, roughly from the Civil War era through the Civil Rights Movement. And really what we are attempting to do is to tell the story of the coming of age of American art and the search for an authentic aesthetic rooted in America. And what you're looking at here, gorgeous image. That's one of my favorite images of Barbara. You can see the Thomas Hart Benton behind her. This was her home, filled with art, obviously. And you see just a selection of works that are on view in the exhibition. So what I'm planning to do today is to walk you through the exhibition, as it were, and give you an idea of the broad scope of what you'll see when you go in person to view the exhibition. The title takes its name from Alfred Stieglitz's An American Place, which was one of several galleries the pioneering photographer established in the first half of the 20th century. So I just want to be clear, this is not an exhibition about Alfred Stieglitz, but he has a role to play, as you will see. I'm really giving this disclaimer because a few years ago, I borrowed a phrase from a Walt Whitman poem to use as the title of the exhibition. And we had all sorts of folks, particularly from Delta, the local high school, English teachers reaching out to us, delighted to schedule tours for this Walt Whitman exhibition. And it wasn't really about Walt Whitman. So we are just borrowing here from Alfred Stieglitz, who, if you're not aware of who Alfred Stieglitz was, he was the husband of Georgia O'Keefe, but he was a photographer, gallerist, impresario of modern American art. His first gallery that he opened in New York was known as the Little Galleries of the Photo Secession. And you see two images from that gallery on the left. Though it had a kind of that long title, Little Galleries of the Photo Secession, it commonly became known as 291 because of the address at 291 Fifth Avenue. He opened it in 1905, ran it until 1917, just at the start of World War I. And initially, his idea was to promote and exhibit fine art photography, but early on, he became an advocate of the European avant-garde, and this is in the years prior to the Armory Show, which happens in 1913. He was showing Rodin drawings, Matisse, Picasso, really challenging his audience, challenging conventional means of representation with the kind of work that he was bringing in. And I love that image of the 2015 exhibition of Picasso in Brock, where he has added African art objects, Mexican pottery, and even a wasp's nest. So he was asking really interesting questions, I think, about art. On the right, you can see An American Place, which he opens. This is the third gallery that he opened in December 1929, which seemingly not an auspicious time to open a gallery just after the crash of the stock market, but nonetheless, that was when it opened. And by the time he opens it in 1929, he has really shifted to a full, deep commitment to American artists. They become really his central focus. So from 1929 until 1946, the year of his death, he runs An American Place. And we decided to borrow this title because it really made us think about the Palmers and how their desire to share their works that they acquired with their friends, their community, and of course the museum that bears their name. So in essence, creating a kind of an American place for students of all ages. All right, the exhibition is divided into 4 sections, and I will take you through these sections. It begins with a section called Breaking Ties that features works by well-known 19th century artists who gradually broke ties with the old world, what some of us call the old world or Europe, as they forged careers during a period of dramatic technological, social, and cultural change. Now, I purposefully left the names off of this slide. I'll give you the names in just a minute, but I want to test you. And so take a quick look, and I'm curious to know how many of these artists you might recognize. And what I'm hoping is by the end of the semester, and by that I mean by the time the exhibition closes, I hope that these will become familiar to you if they are not already. Okay, how'd you do? Pretty well. I will say a few of these are, I would consider them kind of undergraduate bachelor's degree level. That middle column, that's kind of PhD oral exam level, I think. So if you got those, good for you. So this section, the Brainy Ties section, really includes a little bit of everything, from a lush floral still life, and we're looking at the image in the upper left, created by a German-born artist living in Williamsport, whose patrons were making a lot of money in the booming lumber industry. From that to Winslow Homer, just below that, Boy Holding Logs from 1873, Homer painted this image of rural labor in the wake of the financial panic of 1873, and it no doubt held a nostalgically charming appeal for the urban businessmen who were his primary patrons. On the upper right, we have Frederick Church. Now, this actually predates the Civil War. This is 1852, so we do have a few works that are earlier than the Civil War period. A very wonderful Hudson River School painting called Vermont Scenery, although we think it's probably more aptly titled New England Scenery, but clearly embracing the American landscape as subject. And I don't know if you can make it out, but those tiny figures there on the shore in the kind of lower central part of that painting are wearing red and blue. And I think that is certainly purposeful. And below that, Theodore Robinson, Poppy Field, painted about 1885. This is a point when Theodore Robinson, American Impressionist, had already been to Europe, and like many 19th century American artists, he had gravitated to Paris to study the Beaux-Arts tradition, but had been seduced by Impressionism. And by the time he paints this, he's back living in Giverny. And you can see certainly that he is influenced by the palette and the broken brushwork of Impressionism, also probably looking at Japanese prints. Take a look at that very high horizon line. And interestingly, too, he is working from photographs. And in fact, he took a photograph of this field, and that rather strange sort of effect in the lower central part, that kind of washed out looking effect almost, that really actually is capturing the glare, a sort of optical effect from the photograph that he was working from. In the central panel, we have 2 works by Elihu Vedder. And what I love about these 2 works by the same artist is that we really are looking at an artist who has feet in both worlds, right? Talk about breaking ties. Vedder had studied painting in Florence in the late 1850s and painted this absolutely gorgeous landscape in the above central position on the slide, painted in Italy in 1867. He was associated with a group known as the Macchiaioli. Macchie refers to splashes of paint, and these artists were painting out of doors, actually before the Impressionists were doing so in France, although painting admittedly with a narrower range of hues, but an absolutely beautiful landscape. Below, you see an example of what a recent scholar has referred to as Vedder's human still lives, featuring solitary female figures, often just from the shoulders up against a decorative background. And typically, these women are set in some sort of distant land or epic. And you can see here the full title, Ideal Head, 1872. We can see very much this image, I think, is reminiscent of what we would call American Renaissance iconography and style. She is located somewhere in ancient Rome. Interestingly, this work on the left, which actually is quite a small work, was bought by a wealthy Boston widow who was drawn to the sitter's unexplained sadness, is how she described it. It's quite an intimate work, yet has really almost a monumental quality to it. And you can see on the right that Vedder used a sort of similar treatment of the figure in mosaics that he worked on in the Library of Congress. And you can see some similar kind of classicizing goddess on the right. Now, many other artists, of course, were interested in depicting women in the here and now, or the here and then, I guess. And so this is the section that I refer to as the You Go Girl section of the Breaking Ties. And I really want to just look at two of these works in detail, although I do want to mention the beautiful little painting called Aspiration on the right by Arthur B. Davies. I love this image of a young girl who is a violinist, who is waiting, it looks like, for comment from her mentor. And I love the title of this, Aspiration. But I want to talk to you about the other two images. And I want to begin with Mary Cassatt, one of our Pennsylvania artists. She was from Allegheny City, born to a prominent Pennsylvania family, studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, but spent most of her artistic career in Europe. She was aligned with the Impressionists, although she was more in alignment with the faction around Edgar Degas. They were known as the Independents, as opposed to the plein air landscape Impressionists. And you see this fantastic portrait of Mary Cassatt here in the middle by Degas, painted about the time that she created the work that is in the Palmer collection. I include the image, the photograph, an actual photo of Mary Cassatt later on the right, just because I love that photo. And as I told the docents, when they make the movie, Judi Dench is going to have to play Mary Cassatt, at least the older Mary Cassatt. Our drawing is really something quite special because it is related to Mary Cassatt's time with the Impressionists, and it's related to this painting on the left, which is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Woman with a Pearl Necklace in a Loge. Now, this was shown at the 4th Impressionist exhibition, the painting on the left, in 1879. This was Mary Cassatt's first appearance with the Impressionists. Our drawing on the right in a Loge is not a preliminary drawing. This is a drawing that Mary Cassatt made after she made the painting, and she made it because a journal by the name of La Vie Moderne, or Modern Life, was interested in reproducing it. And so she created this drawing that was then used for someone to create a photo etching and reproduce it, obviously not in color, in this modern journal. And I think it's a wonderful painting, obviously a wonderful drawing. This young woman at the Paris Opera, there is a mirror behind her, which allows us to see, particularly in the painting on the left, in detail, all of the folks who are gathering in these different tiers in the Paris Opera. Mary Cassatt loved this idea of spectatorship, and you can just make out on the left, to the left of this figure, a man in black who seems to be very interested in looking at this young woman. And it's interesting when you look at the drawing to see what Mary Cassatt really focused on in translating the painting to pencil. She is very interested in the play of light from that gasolier, which is a chandelier that is gas powered. And also notice that she sort of eliminates some of the I guess we might call them the fluffy details, but she remains very interested in that background, that sweep of those tiers. And also she does sort of remind us too that this figure is over there kind of looking at our young woman. And Lauren Lessing, a scholar who wrote about this piece in the catalog that I was mentioning to you earlier, made a very, very nice point about this. And she said, like the drawing's eager young subject who lowers her fan and presents herself to the public gaze, Mary Cassatt was making her debut as a member of the Parisian avant-garde by illustrating her work for a wide French audience by creating this drawing based on this painting that was shown with the Impressionists. And scholars have suggested too that it may be this very drawing that encouraged Mary Cassatt to start thinking about the possibilities of printmaking right about this time. The print in the upper right in the opera box from 1879, we think is very possibly the first etching that Cassatt made. And you can see that, in fact, it's quite similar to our drawing in a loge. And you can see too that the composition is flipped, because if this is her first print, perhaps she wasn't thinking about that it was going to be reversed. And I also just love the kind of misalignment that happens in this early first print of Mary Cassatt's, but really wonderful special drawing to have by this important American artist. We will move on from Breaking Ties after we look at Thomas Anschutz very quickly. Thomas Anschutz, another artist who had links to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Cassatt had studied there. Thomas Anschutz also studies there and teaches there in the wake of Thomas Eakins being relieved of his duties at the Pennsylvania Academy. And I just make the point that the Palmers, both Barbara and Jim, were at one time on the board of the Pennsylvania Academy. So I think it's very fitting that they have works by these two artists who were associated with that institution. Thomas Anschutz, if you look at these three works here, you can see what a kind of stylistic chameleon he was. He really was very well known for his academic realist style influenced by Eakins, and you can see that in that fantastic genre painting in the center. Also, a very adept watercolors, as you can see in the work that John Driscoll donated to the museum in 2018. And then on the right, the work that is in the exhibition, A Challenge from 1907, demonstrates his virtuosic handling of the pastel medium, something that he was known for at the time. Now, our pastel is very similar to a painting that is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Features the same sitter. The sitter is Rebecca Willen, who she was one of his students and also one of his favorite models. And she belonged to a generation of new women who were casting aside conventional female roles, pursuing higher education, and who were expected to enter, or at least encouraged to enter, professions. Behind her, and Lauren Lessing, again, I'll acknowledge this scholar and colleague, is the one who points out that behind her is a Renaissance cassone, or a carved wedding chest that would have held an upper class woman's trousseau. And she makes the point that Anschutz is sort of playfully referring to Rebecca's unmarried status by putting her in front of this wedding chest and suggesting that any suitor who was wooing this independent woman might face a formidable challenge. The Metropolitan website talks about the image, of course, on the left, a rose, and I think makes a very good point. They say, in portraying this young woman as contemplative and yet intellectually and emotionally alert, Anschutz anticipates the earthier women painted by members of the Ashcan School and other 20th century realists, and we will get to those artists in just a minute. I think it is a good point. Interestingly, though, I did a little searching around looking for other pastels by Anschutz, and note that it's pastel on canvas. And, you know, I think there were many instances where he was really just delighting in the beauty of the sitter and a little less interested in this kind of new woman challenge that Rebecca Willen is offering to the viewer. All right. It's time again for you to test yourself. We are in the second part of the exhibition, Embracing Modernity. So I'm going to give you just a second. I'm going to take a sip of water and see. Now, the one on the lower right, you can probably figure out because you can read the signature. But here we go. Robert Henry, Stuart Davis, Charles Demuth, Ernest Lawson, Martin Schamberg. This next section of the exhibition really focuses on the early decades of the 20th century and looks at two two major groups, the so-called Ashcan realists under the tutelage of painter Robert Henry, and modernists in the circle of photographer Alfred Stieglitz, who were advocating new approaches to image making and challenging the academic status quo. The works represented in this collection, the artists represented in this collection, were committed to investigating independent points of view and spurred on by these charismatic and opinionated leaders, Henry and Stieglitz, pursuing novel subjects and styles as they charted largely unexplored terrain in the 20th century. I do want to call your attention to the Martin Schomburg. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this work, other than there are a few artists represented in this section who were not necessarily affiliated with the Ashcan Realists or the Stieglitz Modernists, but were pursuing independent strategies of their own. Schomburg was working in and around Philadelphia, very much interested in mechanical devices and machines of the modern world, and was working in an abstract visual language that really in many ways anticipated the smooth planes, the very sharp edges of precisionist paintings from the 1920s. The work that you're looking there on the right is from the teens. Much of his industrial imagery was based on the printing and textile equipment that he knew well in his native Philadelphia. As I mentioned to the folks who attended the reception Friday evening, he was particularly interested in the individual components of the device from which women's cotton stockings were manufactured, and I think there's probably more to that story. But I will just point out the rarity of this image, this work by Schomburg, because Schomburg sadly succumbed to the influenza epidemic of 1918. I think we all have a bit better understanding now what that epidemic must have been like and the suffering that was wrought in its wake. So we'll look at just a few examples from this section. We will look first at Robert Henry, and you see Robert Henry there on the left in this great image with Everett Shin and John Sloan, two of the artists who were affiliated with him first in Philadelphia and then in New York. Henry was clearly the outspoken apologist for independent points of view in art making during the Progressive era, particularly during these first 2 decades of the 20th century. He had studied at the Pennsylvania Academy under Thomas Anschutz, had traveled to Europe in the late 80s, was a very influential teacher, championing freedom, experimentation in his students. He also was a champion of alternative group exhibitions, most notably the exhibition of the 8 at the Macbeth Galleries in 1908. Several of the members of that group had had their work rejected by the National Academy in New York in the previous year in 1907. And so they banded together, much like those Impressionists had done in the 1870s, and they offered an alternative exhibition. I will just quickly mention this beautiful portrait in the middle, Mildred Travers from 1921. Henry was especially a wonderful portraitist. He particularly enjoyed painting children. He professed to be drawn to portrait subjects, quote, through whom dignity of life is manifest, and was very interested in a kind of broad spectrum of subjects drawn from a variety of ethnic and social backgrounds. I show you 2 examples on the right, this magnificent Eva Green from Wichita, the Dutch girl, a sort of more generic kind of ethnic type in the upper right, but you can see his gorgeous, if you know the work of Franz Hals, very much that kind of gorgeous virtuosic use of paint. The work in the middle, Mildred Travers, when the Palmers owned it, they knew this painting as Mildred O'Hat. That became its name over the years. So perhaps the sitter was an Irish young woman. I don't really know, but I do know that we were able to look up Henry's diaries and his records and discover her full name. But certainly a vibrant, gorgeous portrait that we are delighted to have. Now, want to look at the influence of Henry on 2 artists, George Lukes and Everett Shin, these 2 gorgeous images of New York on the left. from the early first decade of the 20th century. And then on the right, we will move on and talk a little bit about John Marin. But what a wonderful trio of works this is from the exhibition. The two on the left are actually installed next to one another. So I think it just makes a wonderful sort of point of conversation. The Marin is a little bit further over, but nonetheless, I think these three images of New York are quite telling. Henry's teaching to his students was really very much indebted to what French artists, the realists and the impressionists, were doing in the decades before the Ashcan realists started making these wonderful images. And it reminds me of the poet Charles Baudelaire, who in an essay in 1859, an essay called The Painter of Modern Life, had talked about general versus particular beauty. General beauty is the art of the classics, it's the timeless and the eternal. And he talked about the need for an artist to capture the particular beauty, the beauty of circumstance, the beauty of manners, the beauty of the here and now. And Baudelaire said for the modern artist to capture that, the modern life, the style must be fleeting. It must be transitory. It must be contingent. In other words, modernity is the fleeting, the contingent, the transitory, and the style that captures it needs to be as quick and fleeting and contingent and capture that vibrancy of life. For Baudelaire, the model artist was a flaneur, who at the time would have been considered a male, but a flaneur, a passionate spectator who strolls the streets, observing all that was around him. And many of these young artists, including Shin and John Sloan, had been newspaper illustrators, particularly in Philadelphia before they moved to New York. And they were used to this notion of capturing the story quick, getting out there, experiencing it, and translating it in a style that sort of captured the modernity of the subject matter. And this aesthetic, I think, informs Henry's teaching. It informs the art of the Ashcan school, and it certainly informs George Luke's and Everett Shin. So we looked at these two together, and for the sake of time, I will move quickly through these. But what I love so much is the horizontal orientation of the Lukes and the vertical orientation of the Shin. I think it makes such a nice comparison. On the left, a vibrant scene looking at a community. On the right, a much quieter scene focusing on one lone figure. George Luke's from Williamsport originally is in that Henry Circle in New York, very much interested in the new teeming neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan, neighborhoods inhabited by Italian immigrants in this case, the busy vendors on the street, folks coming to buy fruits and vegetables. And he renders it in this just brilliantly, painterly, wonderful style, not giving us more information than we need, but capturing this sort of, again, this kind of teeming vibrancy of this Italian immigrant community. For him, this is where life was, this was where modernity was, and he renders it in just these remarkable, quickly applied, broad areas of color that describe, but not define the details of this dynamic scene. Shin, like Anschutz that we looked at just a bit ago, was another artist who was quite adept with pastel. And many of his early works, like these that you see before you, he was using the pastel medium. And as you can see on the left, he too is looking at, what are the scenes on the street? What do we see every day when we go out? And I'm going to capture that in that kind of contingent, fleeting style that Baudelaire talks about. Now, Shin, like Luke's, is interested in these neighborhoods in the lower part of Manhattan, particularly in the tenement buildings that are being used at this time. I read somewhere that by 1900, something like 2 million people in New York City lived in tenement housing. In many cases, these were single family dwellings that had been had been made into multiple dwelling apartments, or these were new buildings that were erected to try to accommodate the millions of immigrants that were coming in. I found this image. Now, this is on the north side of Manhattan, but you can see how densely packed these buildings were. You can also see how they hung their laundry. Molly Hutton, who wrote about this in the catalog, the image on the right, the Shin, she really talks about how, there would not have been much light and air coming in. These were pretty kind of closed off areas behind the buildings. And so she reads this as a kind of image of confinement. Interestingly, I just learned, and I think this is true, from a Life magazine article in the 1950s that reproduced our laundress, Pastel. They pointed out this was actually what Shin saw from his apartment. And that very well may have been someone who was hanging his laundry. And at any rate, it is absolutely a fantastic image, and we are just thrilled to have it. Now, if we take a look at the Lukes next to John Marin, downtown district Manhattan, we can really see how the Stieglitz circle artists, what they're interested in, whereas the Ashcan realists were interested in the human inhabitants of the city. Modernists like John Marin were interested in engaging the city as a kind of dynamic living entity that was energized by this rush toward the modern age. Now, John Marin had been trained as an architectural draftsman, fascinated by urban development. And in our watercolor on the right, you can see that he is outlining what might very well be the Woolworth building, as this skyscraper that you see there in the center that erupts into the sky and out of the picture plane. It's suggested that possibly the zigzag elements that you see in the foreground actually might be reference to another iconic structure, the Brooklyn Bridge, that he was particularly enamored with. Regardless, I think what he's really interested in is capturing the dynamism of the city, rendering it in calligraphic, syncopating patterns that move across the work of art, and that really do convey the excitement and energy of the urban setting. Quickly just point out two other works. Actually, there are three other works by Marin in the show that I want to make sure you don't miss. This Vermont watercolor from 1924. And the work on the right, just very quickly, this is such a spectacular piece, this late Marin. And it actually, I think, speaks to something about the Stieglitz circle that I want to move to next, which is namely Stieglitz's encouragement of his artists to create an American modernism that is drawn obviously from the American scene, the American landscape, the cityscape, but to make of it something almost of universal import. And when we look at this landscape on the right, 1951, this is very late. Marin was 80 years old when he painted that landscape on the right, and he had that hilarious haircut that you see in the center. This is not titled, Vermont, whatever, or a specific place. This is titled landscape, and you can just make out at the top that hint of sky, this hill, and then this kind of chaos of the earth. Marin described to Stieglitz early on in his career his interest in painting, he said, the disorder under the big order. And it won't surprise you to know that in 1950, the year before this watercolor was created, Marin was shown at the Venice Biennale alongside Jackson Pollock, alongside Willem de Kooning. He was really considered the elder statesman of American art at that point. And he had recently undergone a series of hospitalizations and had watched a nurse with a syringe, which gave him the idea to use the syringe filled with ink to create this just wonderful, disordered image of the world that is just so remarkably splendid. That leads us into the third section, and it is already 20 till. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes on this third section and very quickly touch on the last section as well so that we can open it up to some questions, but we do have some time. So that the Marins that we were just looking at lead us into the third section of the exhibition, which we have titled America as Place. And this is one of the sections, or these sections in the exhibition, I think that really is the one that most breaks with chronology, because we really have been charting a kind of chronology from the 19th century into the 20th century, right? And what we decided to do in this section is to bring together works from a variety of different times. Oh, I forgot, you need to test yourself, see how you do. And here we go. So this section looks at generations of artists who embrace the American landscape as a source of nativist subject matter deeply connected to the country's identity. And we have everything from modernist experimentation. And by the way, the John Marin downtown watercolor that I showed you is actually in this section. But also we see rural byways that beckon to artists who were also in search of authentically American subjects. So this section includes a little bit of everything, including Child Hassam's wonderful Harney Desert landscape from a trip out to Oregon in the upper left. And I will tell you, one of the delights of working on an exhibition like this and having publicity going out and folks being aware that we're doing this is I had an email just this morning from somebody who was able to tell me in more detail exactly where they think this location is. And they were delighted to see our show publicized in a journal called American Art Review. And so the research continues with this project, but it was very rewarding to hear from somebody about this great painting. Below the Hassam, we have Sloane's Mrs. Riley's A Neighbor's Garden. Sloane spent the teens, often it's the summers in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and it's just a really wonderful ashcan realist painting. On the right is Thomas Hart Benton, Shallow Creek. That's the painting that was behind Barbara in that photograph that I showed you. This is from the late 1930s. And of course, Thomas Hart Benton, one of the great regionalist painters, and here painting the White River, or a tributary of the White River in the Ozark Mountains. And of course, Georgia O'Keeffe is in this section as well. And I am not going to spend much time talking about the Georgia O'Keeffe because Director Aaron Coe is a specialist on Georgia O'Keeffe and of Georgia O'Keeffe, and knows her work very well, and particularly the Lake George paintings. And so we will hear more from her about this painting when we gather for our next webinar. But I think in many ways, like we were talking about with the Marin, this sort of idea of creating this gorgeous, almost this nocturne of beautiful color, abstracted shapes, taken from the specifics of Lake George, but then creating this absolutely glorious sort of abstracted image. Georgia O'Keeffe said, how is the great American thing going to happen if talented American artists continually travel to Europe and continue to look to Europe? And so she and Stieglitz were certainly aligned in this, in encouraging their artists to go to the Southwest, to go to Maine, to go to Oregon, and to be inspired by and create this, what she called the great American thing. I want to look just quickly at another Stieglitz Circle artist in this section, namely Marston Hartley. Marston Hartley was a New Englander with a nomadic disposition. He was a native of Maine, but traveled widely in search of education, inspiration, and acceptance, both personal and professional. And on the left is one of his absolutely brilliant paintings from the teens, the synthetic cubist inspired portrait that he made in Germany, a portrait of an officer that he was deeply enamored with, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He had to return to the United States because of World War I and reluctantly repatriated and embarked for the Southwest in June of 1918. And the New Mexico landscape that you see there was a gift of the Palmers in 2002. So this is one that might be quite familiar to you. This was painted a few years later. He referred to it as his New Mexico Recollections, but it was inspired by a trip he made in 1918. And that year, Hartley published an essay in which he said, "I am an American discovering America." And again, I think the Stieglitz Circle and the Henry Circle and many of these artists that we are looking at would have felt this way. I am an American discovering America. And Hartley certainly felt that New Mexico would spur a new kind of realism in his painting. And you can see that he shifts away from the synthetic cubism of his earlier style and would lead to a kind of revitalized engagement with what he considered to be the uniquely native characteristics of America. Now, the work on the right is just absolutely splendid. Later painting by Hartley, Mountains and Stone, Dogtown, and you see a drawing of this same location that came to the Palmer thanks to John Driscoll. And in this work, we see Hartley's enduring fascination with geographies that resonated with history and mystery. Dogtown Common was a desolate, abandoned settlement dating back to the 17th century near Gloucester, Massachusetts. It's a landscape punctuated with glacial rocks and remnants of stone walls, and it has a really almost otherworldly kind of aura to the place. As Hartley said, a sense of eeriness pervades all the place. The place is forsaken and majestically lonely, as if nature had at last formed one spot where she can live for herself alone. And this work certainly anticipates Hartley's late great style, or his great late style, very kind of muscular, emphatic physicality of the paint application, deliberately inelegant, almost even a crude technique. Notice on the upper left, this tree, this cruciform tree, suggesting a cross and evoking themes of abandonment and even martyrdom. And certainly it's easy to have an autobiographical reading of such works as these late works by Hartley. Hartley, in many ways, saw himself as unloved, in part, and forsaken, in part due to the fact that he was gay. And I think that there is a kind of emotional gravitas to this work, to these rough-hewn, late, demonstrative works. And I think that this element really, this emotion and this sense of abandonment and martyrdom comes through these works. And that leads to the final section. And I'm just going to give you a quick second. Test yourself again. And here we go. And this is the final section that we are calling Diverse Voices. And it does have a number of artists that you've seen before, including John Sloan, this wonderful painting of two young women from the Southwest in the central part. There's a Thomas Hart Benton print. But we also see works by Paul Cadmus, George Tooker, these remarkable magic realists at mid-century who were challenging heteronormative gaze with their subject matter. We also see social realists, white social realists, Black social realists, works by Gwathmey and Jacob Lawrence. And I'm really going to leave you here with these. I might show you one more slide, but I want to talk with you about why we decided to have this separate section called Diverse Voices. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because Friday night at the opening reception that we had, a really wonderful, very, very smart patron asked me, do you think we will always need to have a section that calls out the diversity? And isn't it something that is just really part of this tapestry of American art? And I think, yes, that is true. And that it is part of the tapestry. And I think the other sections that we were just looking at, think about the women artists that are represented. Think about gay artists who are in those sections. I'm thinking of Marston Hartley, Charles Demuth, for instance. In this section, we are celebrating diversity of subject, diversity of makers. So it's really, I don't have an answer. It's really, and I'm not really sure I'm posing a question, but I think it is an interesting question, because one thing that I think is so remarkable about the Palmers was the diversity of their taste, their willingness to embrace this full narrative, and to really embrace the breadth of American art. I will show you this last pairing, because I think it's just such wonderful works. And then I'll leave just a few minutes for questions. But I love this Robert Gwathmey alongside Jacob Lawrence, one on the hand, a white artist raised in Virginia, who was very, very interested and dedicated to Black subject matter. On the right, Jacob Lawrence, Harlem Renaissance artist who lives well into the 20th century, and creates this magnificent gouache, Confrontation at the Bridge, 1975. And I will leave you with this. Jacob Lawrence was invited to the White House in 1980 to receive an award, to be commended for his work, his body of work protesting racism. And he declined the invitation. He said, "I never use the term protest in connection with my paintings. They just deal with the social scene." And I would add, they just deal with the American scene, with the American place, right? This is the American narrative that we are attempting to celebrate in this exhibition. So I'm going to leave you with that, because we might have a few questions, but there's so much more to see. There's, I believe, 58 works on view in the exhibition, and I'm going to leave it there. And Victoria, let me know if we have any questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, Joyce. And I do want to encourage all of our attendees to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A at this time. Now, Joyce, we did have one question already from Nancy, who actually had a question about one of the earliest images that you showed. Nancy asks, do you know what book Jim Palmer is paging through in the portrait of the two of them?
Oh, golly. I don't. We can try to find out. Honestly, I don't remember if that is known. And you know who would know? Would be my colleague, Patrick McGrady. So I'll ask Patrick McGrady, and we can find the answer for you. But yeah, I think if I'm recalling correctly, it looks a little bit like a generic. I mean, clearly it's an art book, right? There's a reproduction that you can see. There's a sweet story about that image, because Jerome Whitkin, the artist who painted that, they had met him, they had bought work from him, and he had come to visit them, I think, when they were doing one of the first sittings for that portrait. And they were, apparently it was, I think it might've been a football weekend. They were going, here. And he told them that he thought they were party people. And that he was, that was his sort of first impulse or impression after meeting them. And Barbara always laughed about that this artist thought that she and Jim were party people. But I'll see if I can find out the answer to that question.
Great, thank you. It looks like we also have a raised hand from Judy. Judy, would you go ahead and type your question in the Q&A or the chat, please?
While we're waiting, I will go back to this and just remind you again of the March 30th talk that I'll be doing with Erin, and just a few little teaser questions that we will answer at this webinar, including, I'm trying to remember the ones auto moved there, including which painting in Barbara's collection was once upon a time in the collection of the Hirshhorn. That will be something that you learn. I will share with you which two artists Barbara always regretted not having represented in the collection. It was a third teaser element that I was it'll come to me. I'll think of it. But that kind of, we're going to be looking at in depth at the collection, the provenance of some of the works. And I think there'll be, oh, I know. The third one was which painting was owned by Alfred Stieglitz. So we'll come back to those.
That sounds exciting. We have another question in the chat from Bernard. And Bernard asks, did the Palmers have help in choosing their artworks?
Yes, they did, in the sense that they were working with a series of dealers, gallerists in New York. But I would say no, in the sense they did not have a curator who was working for them or anything like that, or one person that was telling them what to buy. I have a notebook that I came across actually after we did the book. We only came across this when we were working on the final bequest. And it is all of their notes from when they would go to New York. And I tell you what, they're party people. They would cram in a lot of visits when they would go. And you could see, we're going to start at this gallery, we're going to go to this gallery, the next one, this next one. And they would write down what they'd seen and what they thought. And, Jim was so funny. He was always like, not a very good one, about something. And, or, boy, this is interesting. And we're thinking about this. So they were the best kinds of patrons in that they educated themselves. They were reading a book, as you know, from that portrait. They did have a nice library of art books, but they really did educate themselves. But at the same time, they didn't have a list that they were checking off. So when I mentioned that there were two artists that Barbara always regretted not having, that I'll tell you about, it wasn't because they were trying to have a complete list. It was because it was two American artists that she felt very, very strongly about. And it was just difficult to find work by those artists. So yes, I think they had mentors, John Driscoll, Penn State grad, who sadly we lost, at the beginning of the epidemic. He worked closely with them. They had other close relationships with gallerists as well. They tended not to buy at auction. They tended to buy from gallerists.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we don't have any more questions at the moment. I will say that we did get a comment in the Q&A from Judy, who was a grad student when the Palmers first started collecting. So I think that speaks to how exciting this exhibition is and their legacy. Oh,
I think I might know who that is. Hi, Judy.
We did just have a question from Nancy, and I know we're about at time, but Nancy was wondering how many female artists are represented and what percentage of the total. I don't know if you have that.
Oh,
number.
I don't have it. Now, within this particular exhibition, I'd have to think about it. There's at least 3 women artists. And of course, we've got a really great ones with Mary Cassatt and Georgia OKeefe. Particularly her post 1945, the works that that they collected, later works, there's a number of women artists represented. I don't know the exact percentage, but there was something that Barbara in particular, I think, was interested in.
Great.
But thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it. And I hope you'll come see these gorgeous works in person.
Yes, thank you once again, Joyce. This was so fascinating. And I also want to encourage everyone to come and visit and see this exhibition because it really is quite special, I think. So thank you so much, Joyce. And thank you everyone else for joining us today.
Thank you all.
That was great. Thank you so much, Joyce.
Hi,
good.
Thanks, Joyce.
Sure.
It was a good job for the public.
Anybody else still in? Or
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, good. Yeah. Well, it's great material. Hard to go wrong.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and close it out.
All right.
Good night,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Nice to see you. Bye.